Hi, I'm Dan Paradise. So, prior to taking this class and starting to work on this project, I fully admit that I didn't know about ethical or sustainable fashion at all. I was completely unaware of all the problems within the fashion industry, and in all honesty, I didn't really care about the types of clothes that I was wearing. I didn't care about who I was buying from or where it was made just because I didn't know that there were even problems related to that, and I never thought about the implications. However, over the course of working on this project, just overall, I've realized just how big of a deal this really is. On one hand, it's an environmentalist issue. It's producing tons of waste every year between the clothes that end up getting wasted because they aren't purchased and just end up getting thrown away, all the water that is wasted to support the overproduction of cotton and similar crops that are used for production of clothes, all the plastics that's used when transporting it, and there's probably tons more waste that's created through this industry that I don't even know about, that I wasn't even able to find out about through my research. And then, on the other hand, it's also an outright human rights issue. People who work in this industry are abused, overworked, underpaid, working in incredibly unsafe conditions that make them put their lives on the line every day. It's absolutely heartbreaking to see that this entire industry is, in a way, just built on top of the exploitation of incredibly unfortunate and mistreated workers. It's an absolute sin. And I think that, especially considering how important the fashion industry is to modern society, that's really something that needs to change. And because of that, I've definitely made this decision to be a lot more conscious about how I'm buying my clothes going forward, who I'm buying them from, where they were made, what the conditions are in those regions, how much probably went into making it, and just in general being much more conscious and putting in a much greater effort to try and help reduce my purchasing footprint when it comes to that. And there's a lot of different brands that have partaken in ethical fashion, but what I will also admit is that because of how little I cared for my own clothes, I ended up not really purchasing from a lot of specific brands. I don't have any that I'm really attached to. However, one that I do recall when I was younger, at the very least, buying a decent amount from was Levi's, and I was at least somewhat pleased to find out that Levi's does have at least somewhat of a track record for working towards ethical and sustainable fashion. There are a lot of criticisms that have been levied at Levi's in recent years, and honestly, they're very justified. A lot of people want them to provide more information on how their materials are sourced, like their leather and their cotton, and a lot of people think that they need to improve the working conditions of their factories. However, something that Levi's has shown multiple times is a capacity to respond to just this sort of criticism and grow and change. This was something that we've already seen in the shifts in some of the materials they use, the removal of certain chemicals from how they produce their clothing once those chemicals were discovered to be harmful. And overall, I really do believe that Levi's is a company that is built on a philosophy of responding to this sort of criticism and growing and changing. And so I fully expect that within a few years, maybe, we may start to see these criticisms responded on with better reporting of their supply lines and where their materials are coming from and improvements in the factories. As a matter of fact, some of these are already starting to happen. One big thing is that they've instated a terms of engagement with their employees that encourages employees to learn about ethical fashion, begin to partake in it themselves, and they even have retreat programs where they send employees to their factories where the clothes are produced so that they can meet the workers firsthand and see these types of conditions that they're working in and how these conditions can be improved. And when you look at all this and just think about how successful Levi's really is, it's a brand that's worth over $5 billion and continues to be really successful every year. It really makes you look at other big brands that aren't doing ethical fashion and think, Levi's, even if it isn't perfect, is at least making strides in this regard. What's the excuse for these even bigger companies that haven't done anything yet? And I think that's the area in which Levi's is doing well that a lot of other companies can learn from, that capacity to grow and the capacity to change. And showing that that massive size and the massive demand that they're put under is not an excuse for not partaking in ethical fashion. That's by far one of the things that stuck with me the most from the research I did into Levi's for this, just because, yeah, they're not perfect. The criticism they get is deserved. But at the same time, they've responded to this type of criticism before. They're likely going to do it again. Why can't other companies that are receiving the same sort of criticism? And then, like, the media that covers Levi's is usually pretty positive about them. Some of those criticisms are oftentimes brought up when ethical fashion producers and content creators are talking about them, but there does seem to generally be a genuinely positive attitude towards the company because of that capacity they've shown to grow, change, develop. And something I realized, however, as I've worked on this project, I've just come to realize that the mainstream media honestly doesn't do enough to cover ethical fashion in general. Even if it was a major topic of discussion for outlets at some point a few years ago, especially after Rana Plaza, when you look at the modern news and try to do research into recent articles on this matter, it very clearly is something that the news has largely shifted away from and isn't discussed anymore, which is most likely because of the 24/7 news cycle that has become so commonplace within the last 2 or 3 decades. It encourages reporters to have a constantly changing flow of information, and because of that, a lot of topics that aren't as mainstream anymore end up getting dropped. And this is what I think is a major problem with how modern news coverage works, and especially when it comes to something as important as ethical fashion, a movement that could be incredibly important both for advocating for human rights and advocating for environmental protection. I think that's an area in which the media really, really needs to improve. That's my biggest hope for the future with this, and with media in general, not just for ethical fashion, is that we can get a greater focus on the things that really need to get talked about. From human rights issues to environmentalist issues, things like global warming, all the way back to the ethical fashion movement. There's a lot that I think needs to get covered, and I really hope that in the future, whether it be from a new generation of journalists, from smaller outlets taking up the torch, or any number of other possibilities, I really, really genuinely hope that we are able to see that sort of positive change in the journalism scene.